Supposedly, Spider-Man Far From Home is going to have a big juicy reveal about something having to do with the late, great Tony Stark that may tarnish our image of Iron Man forever. Considering Tony once created a psychopathic robot hell-bent on destroying all of humanity as we know it, we can't wait to find out what terrible thing he may have done this time, and let's face it, this might just be the worst thing Pepper ever caught him doing. Could this secret have something to do with our pal Peter Parker and why Tony was always so determined to keep him safe? In the early days of superheroes, they were often presented as totally infallible beings who fought for justice, never wavered when faced with a moral dilemma, and always managed to look perfect. It was Marvel who changed the game by creating characters who might have superpowers, but that doesn't mean they're not plagued with the same drama and issues that the rest of us have to deal with. Look at Iron Man in particular, who Stan Lee created during the Cold War when everyone was freaked out about the prospect of nuclear weapons. So he decided to make a character as unlikable as possible and see if he could get people to like him. Hey, when you're a talented guy like Stan Lee, apparently you have to really challenge yourself sometimes. So he made a super rich, narcissistic character who made a fortune supplying weapons to the military. Yet miraculously, he managed to make us care about Tony Stark by presenting him as a flawed character. The MCU version of Tony Stark started out pretty unlikable, but by the end of the first movie, most of us had been convinced this was a character we cared about. We've seen him confront his fears, deal with trauma, and learn to be a father. The only thing we haven't seen him do is stop talking about how attractive Marissa Tomei is. Seriously, can't wait for more of those jokes in Far From Home. Speaking of Far From Home, we know Happy Hogan is going to take over drooling over Aunt May duties, but we also heard a rumor about something more unexpected. We've all seen the post-Avengers Endgame trailer, which makes it clear that Tony Stark is gone, and Peter Parker isn't alone in mourning his loss. Of course, most people in the MCU didn't know Tony personally, but they knew who Iron Man was, and he was responsible for saving them on numerous occasions, ultimately at the cost of his own life. If that doesn't inspire some awesome murals, we don't know what does. So, of course, we expect to see the effects of the world without Iron Man, but his legacy may not be all self-sacrifice and awesome supersuits, no. Allegedly, we're going to find out some kind of dark secret about the late great Tony Stark. Of course, we're wondering what it could possibly be. Not that we don't think he's capable of doing something terrible, it's just that we've seen plenty of his personal failures and deficiencies highlighted in Marvel movies. As we mentioned earlier, that's one of the things we like about him. But one possible revelation could have easily happened off-screen, and it would explain a lot about Tony's relationship with Peter. We first saw Peter appear in the MCU in Captain America: Civil War, but even with his standalone movie, Spider-Man: Homecoming, we never got to hear his origin story. Well, Peter briefly discussed the whole being bitten by a spider thing with Ned, but we didn't get any of the juicy details. We totally understand why Marvel Studios didn't go into the gory details, and that's because we don't need them. Everyone knows how Peter Parker became Spider-Man, and that he lost his Uncle Ben and learned some important life lessons about great power and great responsibility in the process. Yada yada yada. In the comic books, there are many different universes with different explanations about where the radioactive spider that bit Peter came from. Everyone wants to know where he came from, but nobody ever asks how he's doing. Did he obtain the powers as a teenage boy? In the MCU, we're not told where the spider got the power it imparted to Peter, but what if it was Tony behind it? Stark Industries is the largest tech conglomerate in the world, and they have tons of resources at their disposal. Sure, they shut down their weapons division, but they're still working on cutting-edge technology. Could they have been trying something with radiation, either back when their weapons programs were up and running, or even since then? Maybe the spider that bit Peter had been tainted due to its proximity to Stark Industries, either on purpose or accidentally. What if Tony Stark knew the truth about where Peter got his powers from and decided to keep it a secret from him? This would explain why Tony seemed to know so much about Peter's powers and why he took him on as an intern. Maybe it went beyond wanting his help in Civil War. Tony did say he felt responsible for Peter, and he did do a lot for him in Homecoming. Was this just out of kindness of his heart, or because he felt guilty knowing he was ultimately responsible for Peter's condition? Now, you might be asking yourself why this would be considered a bad thing. After all, we think it's safe to say most of us would love to have superpowers. Well, did you forget the whole great power, great responsibility thing already? Come on, guys, that's being a superhero 101. Not only have we seen Peter lose his life in Infinity War, we've seen him come close a number of other times. Even in Homecoming, we saw how his heroics made it nearly impossible for him to deal with other areas in his life. In Far From Home, he's trying to get away from being a superhero for at least a little while, but finds himself unable to. Tony Stark knew what a burden it was to be a superhero. So how do you think he'd feel knowing he inflicted it on a teenage boy? The closer he got to Peter, the more guilt he would have felt. Could that be why he risked everything to undo the decimation in Endgame? Maybe he thought Peter would still be alive if either himself directly or Stark Industries caused the radioactive spider to bite Peter all those years ago. Of course, it could be possible that Tony Stark did something horrible, which we didn't see on screen yet. While he sure does like to show up in the MCU, he hasn't been in every moment of every movie, and in Endgame, he was still alive during a 5-year time skip. But what if, instead of revealing some massive secret we haven't seen, we get to see Peter viewing Tony's already established actions in a new way? Everyone knows Iron Man is a superhero who risked his own life to save the day. The guy carried a nuclear bomb through a wormhole to blow up a spaceship. Does that sound like something a villain would do? In fact, there are some Marvel fans who view him as more of a villain than a hero. Sure, Tony has good intentions, but at some point, we have to hold him accountable for his actions. Heck, he believed in holding himself accountable. Back in the first Iron Man movie, he realized the full extent of the horror of his weapons were causing. So he shut down his super profitable weapons division. Hey, that's great, definitely a heroic move worthy of a round of applause, but let's talk about what he's done since then. In Iron Man 2, we saw Tony antagonize Whiplash, and while we acknowledge there's a lot to be said about arguably the worst Marvel villain of all time, his smart remarks just put innocent people at risk. In Iron Man 3, he went ahead and announced his home address, and sure, you can argue this ensured his enemies would confront him. But are we just not going to talk about the whole fact that this put Pepper Potts at considerable risk too? Like she wasn't in enough of a perpetual risk thanks to her involvement with Tony in the first place. She very narrowly escaped certain doom brought upon by Tony's actions. So let's talk about probably the worst thing Tony has ever done, creating Ultron. Yeah, we understand Tony had good intentions and just wanted to keep the world safe, but just because you fly around in a metal suit like a helicopter doesn't mean you have to be a helicopter parent. Tony wants to keep the world safe, but just ends up creating a psychopathic robot hell-bent on wiping out all humanity. Wanda Maximoff even points out that Ultron can't see the difference between saving the world and destroying it, and that he likely got that from Tony. As far as Tony signing the Sokovia Accords, well, that's more of an open-ended question regarding whether it was right or wrong, but ultimately, Tony signed it because he was afraid of what he was capable of and how many people he could hurt. Even ignoring that, let's talk about his involvement with Peter, which we saw for the first time in Civil War. Peter was a 16-year-old kid with a bad case of superhero worship, and Tony totally exploited that to bolster his own cause. He didn't even try to present the issue in a way which would have let Peter make his own choice. He just manipulates a naive high schooler who's trying to cope with the fact that he now has superpowers. And while the airport fight is awesome, it was also incredibly dangerous and Peter could have gotten seriously injured. To make the situation all the more ridiculous, Tony was manipulating Peter to put his life at risk in a confrontation Tony caused with his Ultron initiative and his stance on the Sokovia Accords. In the beginning of Spider-Man Homecoming, it was abundantly clear that Peter idolized Tony, and in Far From Home, we can see he's not the only person who felt that way. We're guessing Tony's actions in Infinity War and Endgame didn't do much to dissuade Peter from believing Tony was a great hero. But viewing Tony's past actions with rose-colored glasses leaves little doubt that he's caused more harm than good in many situations. This could be an extremely sobering lesson for Peter to learn, and we could definitely see it playing out in Far From Home. This could also tie into something we've noticed in the Far From Home trailers, and that's the fact that Peter has some awesome new super suits. We love seeing our favorite MCU heroes display new outfits and gadgets, so don't get us wrong, our hype levels are sky high about this. But who created all of these? We know Tony was behind all of Peter's other high-tech suits, so it seems plausible he also created these. Peter is a brilliant guy, but he doesn't have access to quite the same resources Tony did. At the end of Homecoming, Peter told Tony in no certain terms that he didn't want to be an Avenger. He just wanted to keep on being a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. But if there's a whole new slew of super suits, does that mean Tony directly went against his wishes? Could Tony have been planning to try to coerce Peter into doing what he wanted yet again? This realization could be what gets Peter questioning the actions of Tony Stark, and if he was really the hero he believed him to be. The movie promises to take us into Tony's secret lab, but who knows what we'll find in there? We know Tony equipped Peter's tech suit with a training wheels program and a baby monitor observation program. Maybe Tony should have run those names by the marketing department first, huh? In the comic books, Tony does make a super high-tech suit for Peter, which resembles the one he wore in Infinity War and Endgame. But in addition to letting him spy on Spider-Man, the suit also had the ability to incapacitate him in case he ever went rogue. Naturally, the comic book version of Peter decided to disable this feature, but how will the MCU Peter react? Would he be horrified to know his mentor included such a failsafe in his suit? Or would he take it to mean he could become a villain at some point just like Tony was? If Peter doesn't learn from Tony's considerable mistakes made during his tenure in the MCU, he might just end up repeating them himself someday. What do you think the big reveal about Iron Man is going to be in Spider-Man Far From Home? Share your predictions with us in the comments section, and then click on the subscribe button for more of the latest and greatest videos from us here at CBR. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time.